Have you ever been curious about the government's policy for what price the government should pay for anything it buys? For example, how much should you pay for renovation of the base operations lobby? How do we know what price to pay for a well monitoring and maintenance contract? Or how much should you pay for 1 year of custodial services at your base? What does the FAR allow us to do? How much is too much to pay? And how can we enter into a contract when we know the contractor is offering a price too low to get the job done? The answer to these questions are not difficult, and in fact, the answers are similar to what you are already doing when you buy a house, a car, a computer, furniture, or anything else you would purchase for yourself. By the end of this hour, you will know some key definitions and policies that will help you know what to do when pricing a government contract. By pricing, we mean, in the government, how do we know what price we are willing to pay or allowed to pay? By the end of this lesson, you should be able to state the government's pricing policy, define fair and reasonable, define price analysis and cost realism analysis, determine the sources and means for acquiring data for cost and price analysis, understand the importance of the functional independent government cost estimate and technical evaluation in determining a price fair and reasonable, and define TINA and state its exceptions. Let's get started with what is the government's policy on determining the price of a contract? Well, you can see here the government's policy is contracting officers must purchase supplies and services at fair and reasonable prices. If you click on the FAR reference, you can read the policy for yourself. This policy is somewhat simple. In fact, it is probably the same policy you use when you buy something like a computer, a car, or even groceries. More on this later. About right now, I'm sure you're thinking, well, what does fair and reasonable mean? Earlier in the week, we said the FAR is a very legalized document, so you might have guessed the term fair and reasonable price has a specific meaning. Let's move on and talk about that. Price means cost plus profit or fee applicable to the contract type. We won't talk about fees in this lesson because that applies to more advanced fixed-price contracts such as fixed-price incentive fee contracts and cost-reimbursable contracts, which are outside the scope of this lesson. So price is a fair and reasonable cost for doing the job plus a fair and reasonable profit margin. Let's pause a moment and reflect on the term profit. Is profit a bad word? We will not discuss profit much more in this lesson, so let's take a few moments here to talk about it. What are your initial thoughts? Does profit have a purpose? Can a company stay in business if it is not making a profit? On the other hand, can a company stay in business if it's making too much profit? If you consider profit as the earnings needed to incentivize a company to want to bid on a government project, when they instead could use their resources on another more profitable customer, or earnings used to update equipment and software, or earnings used to overcome unexpected problems in finishing the contract without asking the government for more money, you can see that profit has a definite purpose. Intuitively, you can see that profit is not a bad word. We said earlier the government's policy for pricing contracts is to only pay a fair and reasonable price for something. Now let's break that down just a little. First, let's talk about fair. What does this mean? Does fair mean the same thing to the buyer as it does to the seller? According to the FAR, a fair price refers to fair market value of something. If you want to buy a new home computer, you're normally looking to pay a fair market price, which is the price most people in the marketplace are willing to pay. How do you know what the fair market price of a home computer is? Well, you know the answer to that one. You get out the Sunday paper and look at the for sale ads, or go to the internet and check suppliers in your area. From this quick research, you can usually settle on a range of prices within which you consider the price fair. When the seller prices that same computer, what do you think the seller believes to be fair? Sellers are normally looking to cover all their costs and make a profit sizable enough to cover risks such as product recalls, returned non-working items, investment in the future products, and so on. Buyers, though, are usually at a disadvantage because we don't have access to all of the cost information that sellers have. Sellers know exactly how much something costs, and therefore they know the profit margins. Because we don't know the details of how a supplier has proposed their prices, we're naturally just a little bit suspicious. We don't want to pay more than we should. It's just our nature. What if the supplier's price comes in high? Our first reaction to the proposal is that it must be overpriced and we don't want to waste taxpayer dollars. But is it possible the supplier is offering better quality? On one project I was on a few years back, there were 5 proposals that came in, ranging from $3 million to $5 million. At first look, we thought the $5 million proposal was too high, which is almost double that of the lower priced proposal. But as we delved into the proposal details, we realized the higher priced proposal offered personnel with 2 to 3 times more experience than the personnel offered by the lowest priced proposal. We realized then the price was fair, but it definitely put us in a position where we had to justify our best value decision. As it turned out, we did not have enough money to buy the higher price proposal anyway, so it wasn't too difficult to justify that decision. What if the offered price is too low? Obviously, then we're concerned about the offerer understanding the requirement or having made a mistake in its proposal. Here's a question to think about. Does the FAR prohibit us from paying too low a price? Are you willing to pay a price lower than what you think the projected costs ought to be? Well, the FAR does allow us to pay a low price, even lower than what we think it ought to be, but it also advises us to make sure the contractor understands the requirement before entering into the contract. Let's talk now about what is reasonable. If you thought the definition of fair was somewhat subjective, you'll find the same thing for reasonable. A reasonable price is the price that a prudent and competent buyer would pay, adjusted for market conditions. I'm not going to try to define prudent and competent individually in great detail here. Suffice it to say that much of what we're talking about here comes from various government cost estimating manuals that our cost and pricing analysts use. But I do want to give you a few thoughts to clarify. When we agree to a price, we should know something about what the product should cost. For instance, if I wanted a sports car like the one shown here, and I went to the dealer and paid the price shown on the sticker, chances are I'm not being prudent or competent, for we all know that the sticker price can nearly always be negotiated, and we know that when one dealer knows you are also working with a second dealer, you may get an even better price. But if the car has not come out to market yet, you might want to be the first on your block to have one by ordering it before it comes out. You may actually pay more than the sticker. That's what happened with the car shown above. Customers were willing to pay double the sticker price to get one of these cars, to be one of the first to have one of these cars several years ago. That's not to say they were not being prudent or competent. In fact, they might have negotiated quite well with the manufacturer, but the market conditions were such that you had to pay more than the sticker price to get one of those cars. One take on prudent means you take a thought out approach to shopping for the product. Your strategy for buying the product is thought out. You know something about the suppliers who sell the products, and you take advantage of the tremendous power of competition. If we sole sourced a project or a product when we could have competed and found a better contractor for a better value, we were not acting prudent. Let's talk about, a moment about being a competent buyer. In one sense, competence means you know something about the product. The price you are willing to pay should be adjusted to market conditions. Today, in middle 2010, the summer of 2010, you would not be willing to pay $3.50 for a gallon of gasoline, at least not in the Middle West where we are. But in the summer of 2008, you would gladly pay that amount. What happened between 2008 and 2010? Well, the market conditions changed. You will also take into account the life cycle cost of a product. For instance, you may be more willing to pay a higher price for a car that has twice the reliability of a car that has a lower price. What is considered reasonable can be subjective, but keep these points in mind when evaluating a supplier's proposal, and make sure you document and point out these issues when you are making your final determination that a price is either or not fair and reasonable. Here are a couple of things we must remember when pricing and negotiating government contracts. First, each contract must be priced separately. In other words, we do not ask a contractor who's bidding on a contract to conduct an environmental assessment and at the same time bidding on another contract for water sample testing to give us their best price if we awarded both contracts to them. In our lives outside the government, we may ask a retailer to give us their best price if we buy both the refrigerator and the stove and microwave, but we don't generally do this in the government. As a side note, if a contractor takes a loss on one contract, we don't allow them to make it up on another contract. The next important thing to remember is we generally do not allow the contractor to price into the contract the cost of future events that may or may not happen. We refer to these potential future events as contingencies. Let's talk briefly about contingencies. Here's our definition of contingency for purposes of this course. Read this and then we'll go over an example. Let's take an environmental project as an example, say dig and haul. In this project, the contractor will be required to dig a large parcel of contaminated earth and haul it to an appropriate location. In the contractor's mind, what do you think the contingencies might be in this contract? Some possibilities are the price of gasoline could go up, the price of labor, hitting large rocks while digging, and so forth. You can see the list goes on, and this is probably a short list. The contractor wants to protect themselves from the added costs. Should the contractor price these events into the contract, even though they may never happen? What would you think if you saw a proposal that looked like this? Of course, you wouldn't go along with it because these things may never happen. What if you saw line items for, well, the gas, line item 2, the gas price goes up, we're throwing in an extra $100,000. The price of labor could go up, we're throwing in another $100,000. You probably wouldn't go for a proposal price like this. But you know that the contractors in the back of their mind have to plan for various kinds of risks. The key here is that you will never see a proposal with these contingencies so obvious. Instead, some of these contingencies may be buried in line item 1. When you evaluate a proposal, make sure these types of contingencies are not in the proposal. As a side note, how do we deal with these contingencies? Wouldn't it be unfair if these things happened and the contractor was not reimbursed the extra cost? Well, it depends. We don't increase the price of a contract because gas prices went up, unless the economic price adjustment clause is built into the contract. If the price of labor goes up, which it does every year, we have provisions in the Davis-Bacon Act or Service Contract Act. If the contractor hits rock, we have the Differing Site Conditions clause. If the government wants to accelerate schedule, we have the Changes clause. And if the government delays work, we have the Disputes clause, where the contractor can submit a claim against the government for delay of work on construction contracts. So you see, there is no need for the contractor to propose higher prices to account for these contingencies, since we have clauses that deal with them. As a quick review, we have talked about the government's pricing policy, and we have defined price, fair, and reasonable. We've also talked about the special rules such as pricing contracts separately and pricing contingencies. Let's move on now to 3 methods the FAR says we should use to determine if a price is fair and reasonable. For base level projects like custodial services, environmental assessments, and construction projects, which method used depends mostly on the degree of competition involved. If competition exists, you will primarily use price analysis. If there is no competition, such as a sole source project or modification to an existing contract, you'll want to use cost analysis. For cost reimbursable projects, you'll want to use cost realism analysis. There are many exceptions and variations to this, and sometimes you'll use a combination of methods, but these are just some of the general rules. For base level projects, the most common method used is price analysis. So let's talk more about price analysis. Take a moment and read the definition of price analysis. Price analysis is used most often on base level projects, since most projects are fixed priced and competitively awarded. This is the method you use nearly all the time at home. If you go to your favorite computer store to buy a computer package, you don't ask the salesman for a breakdown of the cost of each component of the computer, such as the hard drive, CD-ROM, and computer case. Rather, you simply ask, what is the price of the entire package? And how will you know if the price is fair and reasonable? You will compare the price of the same or like computer at various stores around you and rule out those computers that are significantly higher priced, but having only the same features as the lower priced computer. The takeaway is that you didn't need to know the cost of the individual components to determine the price to be fair and reasonable. Not only did you save yourself a lot of time using price analysis to buy that computer, but you spared yourself a lot of strange looks from other customers. Price analysis always involves some sort of comparison. Take a moment to remember that. You may see it again. When you shop for groceries, you may buy milk at one store and meat at another. You have compared prices, and you may choose to shop where the prices are lower. But in government contracting, it's not quite as easy to find other prices to compare to. Your challenge, though, is to find something to compare the proposed price to. Now, the ideal scenario is that you get multiple proposals for a project, so you can simply compare one proposal with another. That is the most common situation that we run into in government contracting. But what if you received only one proposal? What would you compare the price to? This is a definite issue and challenge in government contract pricing. Fortunately, we have other things to compare to, such as existing price lists from other companies, previous prices paid for the same item maybe 6 months or a year ago or 2 years ago, parametric estimates, such as what you might find in the RS Means catalog, and your own independent government estimate. When using price analysis, the bidder will propose the minimum information needed to evaluate prices. This actually comes from the FAR. The FAR tells us we should not ask for more than the minimum information necessary from a bidder to determine that the price is fair and reasonable. For instance, if you're buying a supply item such as tools, lumber, spill kits, and so forth, you may only get the unit price and the total contract price and nothing more. Sometimes you may see pricing for expedited delivery or installation if requested. The proposal will not reveal the profit rate, overhead rate, or any other pricing data than what is shown here on this slide. This is by design in the FAR. It costs the government more to evaluate detailed information, and it costs the bidders more to prepare detailed proposals. For a services contract, such as custodial services or water sample analysis, the bidders may only provide us a unit price and overall contract price, much like supplies. Comparing this information to other bidders will help us to determine the price to be fair and reasonable, and therefore prevent us from needing any more information from the bidder to evaluate their price. For a construction project, the only pricing info you may get from the bidder is the overall price of the project, say $400,000. The FAR prohibits us from getting additional information from the bidders unless there is no other way to determine if the price is fair and reasonable. In other words, the FAR again wants us to have only the minimum information necessary from a contractor needed to determine a price fair and reasonable. Let's move on now to the second of the three methods used to determine a price to be fair and reasonable, and that is cost analysis. Take a moment and read the definition of a cost analysis. You may want to remember this. At base level, cost analysis is used when you have minimal or no competition. For example, when you are negotiating a sole source contract or a modification to a contract and you don't have other proposals to compare to. As you can see from the definition, cost analysis is the review and evaluation of separate cost elements and the proposed profit or fee. Shown here are a list of some of those separate cost elements that you would be evaluating. Again, using our computer example, if you were going to do a cost analysis, you would want to ask the computer salesman how much was the labor cost that went into building the computer, and what were the material costs, and so forth. Fortunately, we don't have to do cost analysis to find out if a computer or a car is priced reasonably. But under the circumstances that I just mentioned, in other words, sole source projects and modifications to existing contracts, You won't have readily available other prices to compare to, so you will need to use cost analysis. A proposal based on cost analysis may look something like this. You can see here we have a breakdown of all of the individual costs that build up to the final price. You can intuitively figure out that it takes a lot more time to evaluate this type of proposal, because now you have to determine whether each individual cost element is fair and reasonable. This multiplies your evaluation tenfold. For instance, look at the overhead rate of 125%. Is that fair and reasonable? The short answer is we can't tell. If we do a cost analysis, we have to determine that the 125% overhead rate is fair and reasonable. That is done by calling in auditors from the Defense Contract Audit Agency, DCAA, to review the bidder's accounting records. Therefore, additional government personnel and time is needed. You can see why the FAR discourages this method except when absolutely necessary. Imagine having to do an analysis on each cost element shown here, and get this, on each proposal that comes in. Again, it will take you 10 times or more longer to evaluate the proposals. A lot more manpower and a lot more time. The exceptions to TINA are shown here. For example, if suppliers submit bids in a competitive environment, then we can't request cost and pricing data from a bidder. Oftentimes the engineers want more data supplied by the bidders, such as man hours, material costs, and so forth. Only if absolutely necessary are we allowed to request this information. The contracting officer makes the call as to whether the extra data is going to be requested. This topic of cost and pricing data can be a little confusing as to what you can and cannot ask for from a bidder. We cannot cover it all here. If you're still confused, by all means, ask me any questions in class and we will clarify. Cost realism analysis is the third main method of determining a price to be fair and reasonable. If you think by the name of this method that this method involves determining if the price is realistic as compared to the work being done, you are right. It's that simple. You can see from this slide the intent to be accomplished using cost realism analysis. You will rarely use the formal version of this method, as it is used mostly for cost reimbursable contracts. I usually ask most of the class members that come through the AFIT CE school if they have a cost reimbursable contract at their base. The answer is nearly always no, so we don't delve into this any further. See the link provided on this slide for more information. There is a law you need to be aware of, but you will probably rarely use it. It is called the Truth in Negotiations Act, also known as TINA. TINA requires bidders to provide a detailed cost breakdown in their proposal under certain circumstances. The term cost and pricing data simply refers to all of the usual data you would want in putting together and reviewing a cost proposal. For example, supplier quotes, labor rates, overhead rates, profit rates, and so on. The term certified simply means the bidder must certify in writing that the cost and pricing data provided is current, accurate, and complete at the time it was submitted to the government. In other words, the information must be based on something reliable and applicable to the performance of this contract. You can see the bidders are required to provide the cost breakdown on any negotiated contract over $650,000. I would go into more detail with you, but you can see from the next slide that there are so many exceptions to this law that you will rarely use it. Think for a moment, which of the three pricing methods do you think requires the use of this law? If you guessed cost analysis, you are right. Cost and pricing data are not needed for price analysis or oftentimes cost realism analysis. The exceptions to TINA are shown here. For example, if suppliers submit bids in a competitive environment, then we can't request cost and pricing data from a bidder. Oftentimes the engineers want more data supplied by the bidders, such as man hours, material costs, and so forth. Only if absolutely necessary are we allowed to request this information. The contracting officer makes the call as to whether the extra data is going to be requested. This topic of cost and pricing data can be a little confusing as to what you can and cannot ask for from a bidder. We cannot cover it all here. If you're still confused, by all means, ask me any questions in class and we will clarify. The final topic we want to address today is how is the final agreed price documented? You may think that this doesn't really matter, but it is important that you know this. The CO documents the final agreed price in a document called the P&M or PCM, depending on the dollar value of the project. The P&M tells a story of the acquisition from the beginning up to the point when the contract is awarded. And it explains the details about how the final price was arrived at, the pricing method used, whether you use price analysis or cost analysis, the source selection method used, such as LPTA or PPT, and a summary of your technical evaluation. This document cannot be prepared without your tech eval, so you can see how critical your input is. In the P&M, we must justify that every element of cost in the proposal is fair and reasonable. Here's an important point for you to remember. When the CO finally sits down to write the P&M, they often find small gaps in justification and will often call you and ask for additional support in your tech eval. This can be frustrating because you're busy. As far as you're concerned, the tech eval is done, and you don't have a lot of time to redo anything. But the CO may insist and may even hold up contract award until they get this new additional information. Why is the CO so persistent? Because this is the main document the auditors and inspectors and senators even want to see when investigating what we paid for something. It is also a key document to ensure that fraud is not committed. Often the CO has to up-channel the document to higher levels in the chain of command for review before the contract can be awarded. Another point, remember earlier when we defined reasonable, and we said a reasonable price is what a prudent and competent buyer would pay adjusted for market conditions. The P&M is where we explain how we tried to compete the requirement to get the best price, and we describe any market conditions or product features that play into the price of the item, such as reliability, transportation, warranty, and so on. We've covered a lot of material today. We started out stating that the government's policy on pricing is to only pay a fair and reasonable price. We then defined fair and reasonable. We discussed some special ground rules regarding pricing, such as each contract should be priced separately, and that generally contingencies should not be priced in a proposal. We also talked about the three main pricing methods: price analysis, cost analysis, and cost realism analysis. We discussed the Truth in Negotiations Act and the fact that the final agreed price is documented in a P&M. You now know some of the basics of contract pricing. Keep these things in mind the next time your office puts a solicitation out for bid and evaluates proposals. One final note: contract pricing can get complicated. Your contracting squadron hopefully has personnel who are trained in this area. We often call them price analysts or pricers. They receive weeks of training that the rest of us don't get. Later we'll talk about how pricing a claim, a termination, or an equitable adjustment all have slightly different rules to follow. That's where pricers earn their money. Be sure to consult one of these pricers if ever needed. We as COs do it all the time. That concludes our lesson, and you are now ready to take the quiz on Blackboard.